live stream joining us for it. I'll get to our esteemed guest in just one moment, I should say. But as always, if you're watching this, hit the like button, hit subscribe. If you want to, we're not going to be taking any questions in this, but if you want to, you can hit us with a super chat. And of course, go and become a member at patreon.com/TMBS if you are able to right now. We're talking about Corona in New York City, what's happening across the city, specifically some of the class and educational implications of it. And to do that, I'm very excited to welcome to the show for the first time, I'm sure not the last, Madina Touré. She is an education reporter for Politico based in New York City. Madina, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I mean, first, as I always ask people out of the gate, so far so good in terms of health and safety and so on?
Yes, everything's good. I'm very blessed, working from home. I know there are people in worse situations, so I'm grateful to still be working and trying hard to inform people and get people accurate information about what's happening in the schools and elsewhere.
So on that note, where are we right now in terms of the sort of outbreak of the crisis? There's mixed messages, the same arguments between Cuomo and de Blasio, Cuomo trying to Bigfoot de Blasio about how long the schools will be closed, as an example, or who has the authority to do that. Mm-hmm. The sort of mixed messages about, on one hand, maybe we're peaking, but on the other hand, the numbers are really dire. Like, can you just give us big picture, your sense of where we are right now in New York in the arc of this crisis?
Right. So basically, just to kind of give you all a sense of what's happening, the latest numbers as of April 15th are that there are like over 11,000 reported deaths. So the number of deaths is very high. And I think an important thing to note is that, the initial number that we had did not necessarily have the full picture. Gothamist had reported that there was a discrepancy in the city's reporting process, and they were not including individuals who were dying at home from the coronavirus in the official death toll. So basically earlier this week, there were about 3,778 more deaths that were added to the toll once you include those numbers. And so now the death toll, basically as of yesterday, the death toll soared past 10,000. Now it's past 11,000. So it's even more than we knew. So the death toll is very high. And I think it's, there's been a lot of loss. Like, even when you look at social media, like, I'm sure people personally. I know people who have experienced losses, who, know somebody who's contracted the virus. So the number is pretty high. I know where we are as far as, staying from home situation. The governor has just said that the stay home order is going to be extended until May 15th. So that's, non-essential businesses, school closures. I think also just now, the mayor's office had, announced that permitted events are going to be canceled for May, and they're reviewing June events as well. There's been a lot of conversation about the pools and the beaches and a whole host of things being closed. So, even though the curve is flattened, there's still, we're not necessarily going to be out of the gate anytime soon. I know that the city is also trying to get money from the federal government because the city has had to make a lot of budget cuts as well, as announced today. So and the financial situation is very dire as well. We're going to be seeing a huge impact on the city. We're talking about there's a budget watchdog that says that the city is going to lose like 475,000 jobs, nearly $10 billion in revenue. A lot of key areas are going to be affected. Retail workers are being hit very hard, for example. So it's really affecting the city in a big way. And I think the school system also is being impacted in a huge way as well. Right now the students have been under remote learning for the past couple of weeks. I recently spoke to a bunch of families to kind of get a sense of how they're doing with the remote learning experience. There's still a lot of families that don't have devices. There was something like right at the outset when the city first announced that they were closing the schools, the chancellor said that something like 300,000 families needed devices. At this point in time, the most recent number that the chancellor has given, Chancellor Carranza for the New York City public school system, is that something like 175,000 devices have been distributed, but there's still another 200,000 that need to be distributed. And of those 200,000, 50,000 have been shipped. So it's, there are a lot of families that still don't have access. I know I spoke to a family where there's 11 people in like a 3-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. And there's one student who's, a city college student. She has a sister and a brother. Her sister's 15. And then she has another sister who's 5 years old. So her and her 15-year-old sister are trying to do their homework, their online learning, and then also help their little sister who's learning how to read and write. Another family I spoke to, they're like, also in the Bronx, they're sharing laptops because one received a device, the other didn't. So people are in really tough situations, and some people don't have any devices at all, and so they're falling behind. So
there's also the the food situation as well. I want to get to that. I want to really specifically talk about what you covered in that article. It's a really, really good article, and I tweeted it out. We'll repost it again as well. But what do you make of? I mean, opinions aside, but just like the fact that there still is, amidst this crisis, there is the Cuomo-de Blasio dynamic. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, obviously the Trump dynamic, right? In terms of really specifically de Blasio, who I think, starting with Trump, I'll editorialize the unbelievable negligence of him out of the gate. Then Cuomo actually resisting calls to shut New York City down, which it should have been much earlier. De Blasio fighting to keep the schools open, which is just insane. That's only a matter of a couple of weeks ago. And now, in addition to all of the crisis, the mixed messages, the confusion that it sends when de Blasio says a couple days ago, I think we're going to keep things, at least the schools, until June. And then Cuomo kind of runs out to say well, I mean, that might be the right idea, but it's not his decision. But at the same point that Trump is saying that he has absolute power. Mm-hmm. Can you just connect as a reporter, just the complete confusion and the ways that all of the same dynamics of just kind of petty conflict are also playing out and exacerbating this crisis?
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think, we were all following the school closure announcement. And I think I should say, from the time when the mayor, finally announced that the city was going to close the school system and transition into remote learning, the mayor did say that, they were going to attempt to reopen on something like April 20th, but that there's a possibility that, the schools were not going to be open again for the rest of the school year. So I think, from the get-go, I think that there was a sense amongst everybody that there was a possibility that the schools were not going to open for the rest of the year. And so it wasn't, when the mayor announced that, I think it was something that people expected. It wasn't entirely surprising, even though, it is something that, still shocks people in the sense of now you have to plan to do this for the rest of the school year. I think definitely there was, just kind of seeing the reaction from the teachers and the parents and the families and people across the board, that there was some confusion in the sense of okay, so is it going, are the schools going to be closed for the rest of the year, or are they not? And there was kind of a feeling okay, the politics, shouldn't be here. I know that, I know some people pointed out that they feel that there's a sense that the governor just wanted to say it first, and so maybe that's why he's doing that. I know some people are well, the mayor should have talked to the governor, and they should have, figured it out before making an announcement. But then I know the mayor's office also said they reached out before, right before. So as you said, the confusion does kind of perplex people. And especially I know the sense I was like in a crisis, people just want to be given certainty. And so I think that, but I also think that this is not something that's particularly new either. I mean,
Yeah.
I know that when they were talking about the shelter in place situation, we saw a similar dynamic happen with the governor and the mayor. And I guess all throughout their tenures, there's always been this tension. And so I do think I did definitely sense that there was frustration about that. But I think also that people kind of realize that ultimately the schools won't be open for the rest of the year. So sure, perhaps there's a concern that like, okay, why does it have to be this way? So it's I think that the mixed messaging does frustrate people for sure.
So let's talk specifically about the schools. The big difficulty of this transition and the really strong class implications of it. The difference if you're from a family that's relatively well off, you can kind of figure out. I mean, it's difficult for everybody, but you have the resources. You probably maybe you have an extra computer. You can set your kids up. There's a lot of families in the city that don't have those resources out of the gate, and then there's also and some schools. My understanding is that some schools have still sort of have some like pickup days where kids can pick up meals. A lot of kids in the city are on meals programs. Can you talk about just how that's working out for working families in the city? And talk about, you mentioned a little bit earlier, but just like expand on your pieces for Politico on this.
Right. So yeah. So the city does have these regional enrichment centers that are set up around the five boroughs, and those are for the children of essential workers. So healthcare workers, transit workers, first responders, and then at the end of March they expanded the eligibility requirement so that grocery store workers and some other workers could benefit from those centers too. And then, but I know I think they opened something like 93 and they ended up closing 23 of them because they've been suffering from under enrollment as well. And I know there's been some calls for homeless students to be considered for those as well. And then there are school buildings that are still serving grab and go meals. And the city did extend it so that adults could receive those meals too. And I think that move was praised across the board. It seems that people appreciated that. And I know I did some reporting on, the Jewish and Muslim families, who need kosher and halal food. I know I'd spoken with some advocates and some families who felt like the city dragged their feet a little bit in that area, but now they're I guess the last I heard was that they were in touch with vendors and they put out a bid for these meals as well. So that's sort of what's in terms of the schools that are still set up. I know that, with the center, sometimes people express concerns about, safety and like being in these spaces and stuff. But so that's essentially what's happening there. And in terms of like the experiences of families, I've been speaking with a lot of parents and teachers and families, and just it's as you said, like families that have access to devices. I mean, I think people across the board, across socioeconomic statuses, are probably experiencing different sorts of challenges, but it's clear that those who are in low income communities are probably dealing with it, not probably, but definitely dealing with it in a bigger way. I mentioned before families that I had one family that I'd interviewed. They are, I think it was a woman, their family's from Ecuador. They're her three kids are English language learner students. One of them's at 11 and at Action Academy. The other two are at Crotona International High School, which is an English language learner school. And so she actually, was telling me that, the school was providing certain supports for English language learner students, but that since they've been under remote learning, they haven't really been receiving those supports. And then, of course, there's the whole device issue where they're sharing one laptop. She mentioned also that there were some issues with certain laptops not being in the best condition and a lot of confusion. I know I spoke to another family in Queens. The woman was from Nepal. She was talking about how, so it's like her husband, they have a daughter in high school at Stuyvesant and another kid at a IS5 in Queens. They're in a 1-bedroom apartment. They're kind of cramped. And so they all have to kind of be in corners and stuff. I I know I spoke to another family that maybe isn't going through as much struggle. Like she's at the Linden Tree School in the Bronx as well. And she was saying that, she kind of has to balance like, her daughter who's like 8, or like her daughter's in elementary school and is, has to do her homework. And then she has 2 younger children who aren't school age and they want to play with her sometimes. So there are all these different dynamics. And yeah. And then also another thing that's important to note is like, sometimes like things that certain sources have told me is that sometimes people overestimate people's degree of comfort with technology. Especially like this one teacher, Isla Tawhid at Linden Tree Elementary School in the Bronx, she was telling me that, so many parents, like she had to post a video on her site to kind of explain to people, how to log on, because she set up a site for like remote learning for her particular class. And like parents were still calling, like, how do I log on? How do I do this? How do I do that? So, there's sort of a learning curve there. And even for students, like, maybe students are comfortable with certain apps, but, when you're talking about online learning tools like Zoom, and there are all sorts of tools that, are developed for specific grade levels, like people have to learn how to use these things. So sometimes there's a feeling like there's even like, the time that it takes to learn how to use these things. And then there's also a question of the fact that now so many people are on the internet at the same time.
Right.
So sometimes internet connection can be tough, if multiple people are trying to log on and do their assignments. So there are all these, that's also an issue as well. Like, training people on how to use the technology. And even what the week in which the teachers and principals were undergoing a remote learning training, there were varying levels of experience. Some schools and teachers have already been using Google Classroom and all these other platforms, but then there are others that, they had to learn how to use it. So there's also like, there's the class issue, people not having access to devices. And then there's also like being familiar and comfortable with technology. And then not to mention also like there are vulnerable populations like students in temporary housing, students with disabilities. They need occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy. Doing that online is difficult. English language learner students. I know in the African community, there are specific challenges like literacy issues and languages being oral languages. So if you speak a language that isn't among the DOE's 9 languages that they provide services in, then, but your language is not one that's written, like how are you going to receive the translations to be able to supervise your child? So there are all these like varying levels of challenges that, have to be addressed.
Do you, in addition to all of those big material challenges and concerns, do you think that I've heard, and this is on more, this is on the collegiate level, but I would imagine it would probably apply even more so to people working with younger students. But we've definitely talked to professors on this show and others, and there's just like that the whole, in their view, like the myth of technology replacing actual physical classrooms is, just that, a myth, right? Like, okay, maybe it can be supplemental. Maybe we can, use these tools to some extent. But at the end of the day, you really do need to have, that discussion in person, that ability to actually see what's going on with the students you're working with, to, look at how they're processing the conversation or the information. I'll just say, as one tangent, the only thing that really has amused me about this was there was a report from China very early on that that teachers in quarantine themselves, who were still giving lessons to these students, they were using a specific app. And I guess on the Apple Store, if an app gets below 1 or 2 stars, it's taken automatically off the store. So the students like flooded it with terrible reviews and got the app taken out.
Wow.
And that helped them out from not having to do their work for a couple of days, which I thought was, they should have passed the class based off of that invention, that innovation. But anyway, as you look at like the bigger conversations around test taking, around the kind of like attacks on the teachers unions, and really around the kind of argument of what environment actually is conducive to education, is this kind of like also a crisis experiment on the idea that you can move outside of classrooms increasingly and substitute technology?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, and I've been hearing these types of conversations as well. I know I know some charter schools, like people I've spoken with in charter schools, have kind of mentioned that, they some of them are kind of accustomed, for example, to remote learning and online learning. I know I spoke to a parent whose kids are at democracy prep, and she was saying, yeah, well, the transition was fairly smooth because we've already been like doing stuff online. I know that people have kind of had that conversation about how there are aspects of remote learning that are beneficial, and that that it could help address certain issues, like making sure that people are staying on top of their work or participating in class. And so I have heard that, but I think that for people who are, and there are people who do online learning and are successful at it. And so I think maybe this period isn't as challenging for them because it's an option they've chosen, and that's a perfectly fine option. There are people who do online learning, it's successful, but on the flip side of it is like people who are people who are used to in-person instruction and have chosen to do in-person instruction are used to that, and so they're going through this whole process of adapting. And I know even in terms of higher education in CUNY, I know that students are experiencing their challenges as well. I know I've had friends who tell me, yeah, online learning is really difficult. It's hard to focus. They're not used to it. And then there's also like the thing of people learning how to use the tools, like even faculty, they have to be trained as well on how to use certain platforms and tools. And they also have issues with device access as well. But I think, I think that another interesting element too is like one person I spoke to, Baruch College professor, was Stan Altman, was saying that, there's also a question about, the tech, there's so many tech jobs in the city, and tech jobs are kind of the future, but, in certain communities, like in low-income communities, in Black and Latinx communities, for example, they're not being trained on like these technological skills. And so in some ways they're kind of missing out on all these jobs. So there's kind of a question about like, what is the way forward to do certain schools or certain communities need to have more training, more access to STEM programs so that they can be prepared for these things. That's also like an interesting conversation as well that's been happening.
In the last couple of minutes, is there something that, I mean, from the amount of people you're talking to, parents, teachers, students, and that whole ecosystem, I mean, what is the sense you get from them of what would be the best way for the state and the city to start to address the crisis we're in? Or is it, maybe not or, but in addition to that, is it also just a reinforcing of all of the, like, yeah, there's a unbelievable amount of income inequality, there's housing insecurity, and that this stuff just makes that, it just adds pressure to an already incredibly pressed system. And, in a way, like, depressingly, there's not even that much new information here. Like, what's the kind of main feedback basically for how people would like to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've been hearing is that, like, as you said, like, like a lot of these issues were present before this crisis hit. There's people, we talked about students in temporary housing, students with disabilities, English language learners, families in low-income communities. Their situations were already tough when we were in, normal times or normal conditions. And I think now that we're under remote learning, those situations are being exacerbated. I mean, on the subject of students with disabilities, I know publications like The City and Shakopee and a number of other reporters have written about, the system being kind of overflooded with special education complaints, and there not being enough hearing officers. And that was already an issue before this crisis hit. And, there are also these preschool special education classes because of lack of funding from the state and maybe to some extent the city, but it seems like people say it's more so the state. There weren't enough seats available and teachers not being paid enough. I mean, those kinds of issues are exacerbated now that we're under remote learning. Like, there have been all sorts of issues with students with disabilities, individualized education programs not being fulfilled under remote learning. It does become harder. Same thing with students in temporary housing. If you don't have access to the internet, or your internet is spotty, I mean, as you said, like this crisis is exacerbating a lot of things. I do think, and I think that now there's kind of conversations about like, okay, like what are we doing to address these problems? Like, people kind of want the city to address these issues. And then there are other things too, like the Regents exam was canceled, the June one. The state tests, a number of state assessments, including the ones for third graders, were canceled as well. And I think that kind of, because of this pandemic, and I think that kind of sparked a conversation about like, there's always been these concerns about high stakes testing. Right. And the need to shift away from it. And so now those kinds of conversations are happening again. And also, there's also, there are also issues like, I know one person I spoke to for my story today about, the kind of socioeconomic disparities and how that affects remote learning experience. David Bloomfield, who's a professor, he was kind of talking about issues like summer slide. And, and that's like, that whole issue is about, students, an achievement gap that occurs particularly in low-income communities during the summer, where they lose some of their the things they learned during the school year. And so there's a concern about that. There's a concern about how this, and what he said, which was interesting, is that the learning deficit can be overcome, but the question now is the educational and the future economic gaps that will occur. Like if students who students who are maybe more affluent, who have, been online and are used to it and have been doing their work, might be ahead of students who haven't been able to log on. And so the long-term impacts there. And then we've had a big conversation over the last 2 years about segregation in the city's public school system. And what he was talking about was just like, you're going to have whole classrooms of people who haven't been able to log on, who haven't been able to do remote learning because they don't have device access, and then a whole classroom of people who have been able to. And so there are all those questions too. We're talking about everything that's happening now, but how is this going to impact students in subsequent years? So people are kind of, raising questions about that, like what is the city going to do to tackle the aftermath of this, and how this is going to maybe slow down some students' progress.
Absolutely. Well, the pieces are really good. They're really important. Madina Touré, education reporter covering New York City for Politico. We really appreciate your time. I hope you'll join us again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to chat with you.
Thank you so much. All right, guys, we'll be back at 7:00 with Adolph Reed Jr. for another stream. See the sweat of TMBS. Thank you, Madina. Thank you. We'll see everybody soon. Thank you.